You're listening to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book Season 2. We're exploring An Introduction to Criminological Theory by Roger Hopkins Burke. In Episode 9, we dive into the victimized actor model of crime, with a special focus on labeling and conflict theories that challenge traditional notions of deviance. Welcome, everyone, to this deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really powerful and, I guess, in some ways quite an unsettling perspective in criminology: the victimized actor model.
It really is, because up to now in our journey through these theories, we spent a lot of time looking at crime either, through the lens of the criminal as a purely rational agent.
Right, someone making choices based on costs and benefits.
Exactly. Or, on the other hand, through the lens of the predestined actor, where behavior is seen as, well, determined by forces outside their control. Biology, psychology, social factors, that kind of thing.
And both those views, maybe in different ways, often seem to just accept the law, the definition of crime, as, fixed, inherently just.
That's precisely where the victimized actor model really shifts the ground beneath our feet. It doesn't necessarily deny that individuals commit acts that cause harm, of course not, but it introduces this pretty radical idea that the person who ends up being labeled or treated as a criminal is themselves, in a really significant sense, a victim.
A victim? How so? Not of the crime itself, but...
No, exactly.
Yep.
A victim of larger forces, the structures of society, deep-seated inequalities, and this is crucial, the very processes by which society defines and then responds to what it calls deviance.
And the core assertion here is quite a challenge to conventional wisdom, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's the idea that crime, and maybe even more importantly, the process of being criminalized, are heavily influenced by the unjust and unequal aspects of society. This view argues, quite forcefully, that the actions of those who are poor, marginalized, or otherwise disadvantaged get disproportionately singled out, targeted, processed by the criminal justice system.
While at the same time, similar or maybe even more harmful actions by the wealthy and powerful
Often get ignored, or redefined, or maybe they just never even register as crime in the first place. Our source makes this exact point, quoting Box, saying definitions of serious crime are essentially ideological constructs.
Ideological constructs, meaning they don't necessarily reflect what causes the most actual harm.
Right. They don't necessarily target behaviors causing the most widespread or severe objective harm. Instead, they often target specific, less powerful groups, which ends up reinforcing existing power structures.
Wow, okay. That really forces you to think about the definition of crime differently, less as, universal morality or objective harm.
And more as a product of power dynamics. Who gets to decide what's illegal? Whose behavior is society most interested in controlling? It shifts the questions we ask.
And as you mentioned, this victimized actor model isn't just one single idea floating out there. Our source material points to two major theoretical traditions that really give it its foundation, its theoretical muscle, if you like.
That's right. First, there's the perspective that grew out of symbolic interactionism, which leads directly into what we now call labeling theories.
Okay, labeling theories. And the second one.
The second tradition is a fundamental critique of the whole idea that society functions based on widespread consensus and agreement. This leads us to conflict theories.
Right. So labeling and conflict theories.
And both of these, though they come at it from slightly different angles, really shift the analytical lens. They move it away from focusing solely on the individual offender as some kind of isolated problem.
And towards looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly. Towards examining the societal context, the power relationships that shape that context, and crucially, the reactions that society has to certain behaviors and, importantly, certain people.
So our mission for this deep dive, then,
Yeah.
is to really unpack these complex ideas. We need to explore where they came from intellectually.
How they propose to explain crime and criminalization.
And think about their implications, which, as you said, can be significant, maybe even uncomfortable, for how we understand individual behavior and the criminal justice system itself.
And we'll do that by sticking closely to the source material we have here, from An Introduction to Criminological Theory.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Let's dive into that first major foundation, labeling theories. You said they're rooted in symbolic interactionism. Can you help us unpack what that means? What is symbolic interactionism?
Certainly. Symbolic interactionism is a sociological perspective that really zooms in on the micro level of social life. So instead of looking at big, abstract structures like class systems or institutions
Well, you
first,
said everyday interactions.
precisely, it focuses on how individuals understand themselves, understand others, and how they actually construct social reality through their everyday interactions. It's all about the dynamic process of interpreting symbols and meanings in those interactions.
Okay, symbols and meanings. And central to this, you mentioned the procedural self.
Yes, the procedural self. Our source highlights the influence of George Herbert Mead's work here. The core idea is that our sense of who we are, our self-identity, isn't something fixed inside us from birth. It's continuously built and tested and rebuilt through our interactions with other people, especially those Mead called significant others.
Significant others, like family, close friends, people whose opinions matter.
Exactly. The people whose opinions and reactions really matter most to us. We see ourselves, in a way, through their eyes, reflected in their reactions to us. And our identity is formed in this ongoing process of interaction and interpretation.
That makes a lot of sense. So my self-concept isn't just about some inherent quality I possess.
It's much more about how you are reflected back to yourself by others, how they define you, how they react to you.
Okay. And this leads to, what was it? A crucial point about meaning.
Yes, absolutely crucial from the symbolic interactionist perspective. Meanings are not inherent. They don't reside within an object or an action or even a person.
So meaning isn't just there.
No. Meanings are created and assigned through the process of social interaction. As Plummer articulated, it's about how definitions of things, objects, situations, behaviors are constantly being constructed and used as people interact.
And for criminology, this seemingly simple idea has a huge consequence, doesn't it?
Profound. It leads directly to the conclusion that deviance is not some intrinsic property of a behavior itself. An act isn't deviant because of what it is in isolation.
It's deviant
Because a social audience confers that label upon it. Someone or some group reacts to it and says, that's deviant.
that really is a game changer for labeling theory, then. It shifts the whole focus of inquiry.
Completely. Instead of asking, what's wrong with this person? Why did they do this deviant thing? The question becomes, who is doing the labeling? Why this act and not another? What is the societal response to this act? And what are the consequences of that response?
And the audience you mentioned, the ones doing the labeling, that's often official agencies.
Often, yes. The formal agencies of social control. Police, courts. But also informal ones, teachers, social workers, psychiatrists, even family members, peers. Anyone with the perceived authority or power to apply that label. Their reaction is what gives the behavior its deviant meaning in that social context.
Now, you also mentioned this interactionist route drew influence from other perspectives like phenomenology and ethnomethodology. How do they fit in?
Well, phenomenology, particularly associated with Alfred Schutz, it challenges the whole idea that sociology should be looking for some objective, external reality.
So reality isn't objective.
From this viewpoint, social phenomena are only real insofar as individuals define them as real and then act based on those definitions. The focus shifts entirely to subjective meaning. For criminology, this means looking at how people make sense of deviance, and especially how negative or stigmatizing responses from others affect the subjective self-perception of those being labeled. Rock noted how this extended the focus to the agencies actively creating and imposing these definitions.
Okay, so it's about subjective meaning and how labels affect how people see themselves. And ethnomethodology.
Ethnomethodology is another related field. It studies the methods ordinary people use, often unconsciously, just to make sense of everyday life and function within social interaction.
The methods we use to understand each other?
Exactly. And a key concept here is indexicality. It's the idea that the meaning of any expression or action is totally dependent on the specific social context it happens in. There's no universal, context-free meaning.
And the big significance of that for criminology is?
It leads to a radical skepticism towards official criminal statistics. Really profound questioning. While earlier theories might have treated crime stats as, relatively objective indicators of crime,
Ethnomethodologists see them differently.
completely. They view them not as reflections of criminal reality, but as social constructions. These statistics are the end result of the complex, interpretive work done by the agencies of social control.
Like police deciding who to stop, prosecutors deciding who to charge.
Precisely. All those decisions, they're influenced by the social organization, the routines, the biases, the practical considerations of these agencies, not just the raw number of criminal acts committed out there. So the stats tell us more about the system and its activities than about the actual phenomenon of crime itself.
That fundamentally changes how you look at official data, doesn't it? Okay, so building on all these ideas, symbolic interactionism, the procedural self, meaning as conferred, phenomenology, ethnomethodology, labeling theories, as our source outlines them, seem to have three central concerns. What's the first one?
The first concern is, why are certain acts defined as deviant or criminal in the first place?
Okay, why these acts?
This directly challenges that traditional common sense assumption that crime is just about breaking a universally agreed upon law because the act is inherently wrong. Labeling theory says, well, hold on, crime isn't fixed. The boundaries of what's considered criminal behavior shift dramatically depending on the time period, the culture, even the specific situation.
So we can't just accept laws and conventional morality at face value. We have to ask why they exist.
Exactly. This perspective insists that no behavior is inherently criminal. It only becomes criminal when it's subjected to a societal reaction that defines and labels it that way. The nature of the act itself is seen as less important than the response it evokes, especially from those with the power to label. Think about it. Even taking a human life, which seems like a universally wrong act,
Is defined very differently depending on the context. Self-defense, war, execution, manslaughter, murder.
right, the label applied is crucial and highly variable. It's not inherent in the act of killing.
And this brings us back to that famous quote from Becker.
It does, Becker's statement. Social groups create deviance by applying those rules, labeling them as outsiders. Deviant behavior is behavior that people so label. He argues that the rules defining crime aren't neutral products of consensus. They're made and enforced by people who hold power, and they're applied, often disproportionately, to those who don't.
That really highlights the power dynamic, doesn't it? It's
Yeah.
not just abstract rules, it's who is making the rules and who they're being applied to. Our source gives examples.
Like rules made by the olds for the young, men for women, whites for blacks, the middle class for the working class. And you can extend that to institutions like schools making rules for students or parents for children.
So rules are often imposed, maybe against the will or interests of those they govern.
And they're often legitimized by dominant ideologies that make them seem natural or necessary, even when they serve specific interests.
And Becker introduced this idea of moral entrepreneurs. Who are they?
Moral entrepreneurs are the individuals or groups who actively campaign to create new rules or enforce existing ones more strictly. They're the rule creators, the crusaders. Now, sometimes they might be sincere, genuinely believing they're acting for the public good, even if their beliefs are based on, say, misinformation or irrationality.
Or sometimes
Or sometimes they might be more cynical, perhaps motivated by a desire to advance their own group's interests or maintain their position of power by controlling less powerful groups.
And if one of these moral crusades is successful, what happens?
Becker argues it has specific, predictable outcomes. First, it effectively creates a new category of outsiders, people who break the new rule. They didn't exist as deviants in that specific way before. Second, it typically leads to the emergence or expansion of a social control agency tasked with enforcing this new rule and imposing the outsider label. Our source notes this often means more policing power.
Okay, new outsiders, new enforcement. What else?
Third, over time, this new rule, the agency enforcing it, and the deviant role associated with the label become taken for granted, just accepted as part of the social furniture. And this process often solidifies negative stereotypes about the people who fit this new deviant category.
And our source material gives some really concrete examples of this process in action, right?
Yes, several compelling ones. Becker himself studied the U.S. Federal Bureau of Narcotics campaign in the 1930s that led to the criminalization of marijuana with the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937.
What was the official story versus Becker's analysis?
The official line was, marijuana is dangerous, it threatens young people, we need to control it. But Becker's analysis suggested a big motivation was the FBN wanting to expand its power and secure its budget, especially after alcohol prohibition ended.
So they were moral entrepreneurs acting in their own organizational interests.
That was Becker's argument. They successfully lobbied for a new law, created a new fragment of the moral constitution of society, and suddenly a whole new category of criminals, marijuana users, was born.
And there was another example about juvenile delinquency.
Yes, Platt's historical study. He argued the whole concept of juvenile delinquency as a separate category from adult crime wasn't natural. It came out of a moral crusade by affluent middle-class women in the late 19th century worried about poor urban youth. Their campaign created juvenile courts and, crucially, extended the state's power beyond traditional criminal acts to cover status offenses.
Status offenses, like truancy, or running away.
Exactly.
Right.
Things that were only problematic because of the person's age. This dramatically expanded state control over young people's lives in ways that didn't apply to adults.
And the third example was more recent, about domestic violence.
Right. Tierney's analysis of wife battering. For a long time, this was seen mostly as a private family matter, not really a core concern for the police or courts.
But that changed.
It only started to emerge as a major social problem needing criminal justice intervention after the mid-1970s. And that was largely due to the advocacy and pressure from the women's movement, pushing for things like refuges, legal reforms, and giving the police to take it seriously.
So even something causing obvious physical harm wasn't automatically treated as criminal by the state until specific groups pushed for it.
Precisely. It shows how the definition can evolve based on social and political pressure.
So the key takeaway from this first concern of labeling theory seems pretty critical. Changes in law, what gets defined as crime, aren't just about objective harm or how common something is.
No, they're often the result of intentional efforts by social groups, these moral entrepreneurs who have enough motivation and, crucially, enough power to influence the rulemaking process and redraw the lines of acceptable behavior.
It definitely makes you wonder about things happening today. What harms aren't defined as criminal simply because the groups involved have the power to resist that label?
That's exactly the kind of question this perspective raises. Erickson also added an interesting macro-sociological twist, drawing a bit on Durkheim. He saw social systems as having boundaries defining acceptable behavior.
And deviance marks those boundaries.
In a way, yes. He argued deviance isn't just rule-breaking, it actually helps mark those boundaries for everyone else. The interactions between labeled deviants and control agents become boundary maintenance mechanisms. So paradoxically, by reacting to deviance, society shows its members where the lines are and reinforces a sense of solidarity among those who conform. It connects labeling back to functionalist ideas, though it's not the most common pairing.
Interesting. And Quinney also tried to bridge labeling with broader structures.
Yes, Quinney tried to connect labeling more explicitly with conflict theory ideas. He talked about singular societies, homogeneous shared values, crime as an anomaly versus segmental societies.
Like most modern nations, heterogeneous, conflicting values.
Right. In segmental societies, he argued, criminal laws represent the values and interests of the politically powerful segments. So your position in the social structure, class, race, gender, age, directly impacts how likely you are to be labeled criminal.
Which leads us perfectly into the second central concern of labeling theories. Why are certain people or groups more likely to be labeled than others?
Exactly. This challenges the idea that labels like criminal are applied fairly and universally to everyone who commits a similar act. As Becker noted, the reality is way more complex. It's not just that some people get falsely accused, although that happens. It's that out of all the people who break a given rule, only some are actually detected, caught, and officially processed. There's this huge, hidden figure of rule breaking that never shows up in statistics.
So getting labeled isn't just about what you do.
It's also very much about who you are, the context, who sees you, and how they react.
Okay. And Kitsu's study was important here.
Yes, Kitsu's study, though focused on homosexuality, had wider implications. He argued being labeled deviant wasn't just about the behavior itself. It was about the interactional process where that behavior gets defined as deviant by others and sanctions get started. Who gets defined as deviant, he found, depends on a whole load of things beyond the act itself, the circumstances, the person's background, their biography, and the specific bureaucratic routines of the social control agencies involved.
And other studies confirmed this, showing that things unrelated to the actual crime influence the outcome.
Consistently. Studies in the US and UK show that these extra-legal variables significantly influence the official response. Things like your appearance, your demeanor with police, your ethnicity, age, gender, social class.
Even the time of day or where it happens.
Yes, even seemingly trivial things like that can play a role in whether you get processed and labeled.
And there was a classic study on police and juveniles, Pilyovin and Breyer.
Yes, a hugely influential study. They observed police encounters with young people and found arrest decisions were often based less on the specific offense and more on subjective judgments the officers made based on physical cues, manner, dress, appearance.
They were inferring character from how kids looked and acted.
Pretty much. And crucially, structural factors mattered enormously. A young working-class black male in a high delinquency area at night. Much higher chance of being stopped, questioned, arrested compared to others. The police often assume delinquency unless proven otherwise by behavior during the encounter.
And similar findings in the UK, too. about class and race bias.
Yes, studies by Smith and Gray, the Institute of Race Relations, pointed to systematic biases in police practices and outcomes here as well.
Ciccarel's study added another layer about background expectations.
Right. Ciccarel looked at the sort of common sense, often stereotypical theories that officials, especially police, held about what a typical delinquent looked like or how they behaved. These unconscious biases led officers to focus on certain types and certain areas. He also found the officers' own definition of their role mattered, where they strictly due process, focused on the letter of the law and evidence. Or more crime control, focused on suppression and relying more on subjective judgment.
And he concluded this whole process was biased.
Inherently class biased, yes. It led police to target working-class areas and individuals who fit their typifications.
And it wasn't just the police. Other officials reinforced this.
Ciccarel found that others in the system, probation officers, social workers, court officials, often reinforce these practices. They operated with their own theories about what causes delinquency, broken homes, permissive parenting, poverty, and applied them in ways that unintentionally targeted disadvantaged youth. In doing so, they could inadvertently set these young people on a path the system itself defined as a delinquent career.
This has massive implications for how we read crime statistics then.
Absolutely. From a labeling perspective, stats aren't a neutral measure of crime out there. There are social constructions, products of the activities, criteria, and biases of the control agencies. They tell us more about the agencies and their practices than about the actual amount of crime or the true hidden figure.
And Quinney explicitly linked this likelihood of being labeled to power structures.
Yes. Quinney identified key structures: age, gender, class, ethnic group. He argued that people in less powerful positions within these structures, say a young, black, working-class male, are way more likely to be defined as deviant and processed. Their overrepresentation in stats isn't necessarily because they commit more crime, but because the system's criteria and practices reflect the interests and biases of the powerful segments of society. Essentially, the powerful label, the powerless who violate the norms the powerful uphold.
Okay, so that covers why certain acts get defined as criminal and why certain people are more likely to catch that label. This brings us to the third concern, which you said is maybe the most discussed. What are the consequences of getting that label?
This is really where labeling theory makes its central and often quite counterintuitive argument, that the very act of reacting to people as criminal can actually push them towards becoming more criminal.
The intervention makes things worse.
It can, yes. The intervention of the criminal justice system, intended to stop crime, can perversely have the opposite effect, deepening the individual's involvement in a criminal identity and lifestyle.
And Tenenbaum called this the dramatization of evil.
Right. Back in 1938, he described how a community might first see a young person's act as bad. But with repeated negative reactions focused on the individual, the community starts to define the person as evil. This leads to separation, specialized treatment, punishment or cure, more isolation, and eventually the individual starts to internalize this tag or label. They redefine themselves based on how others see them, coming to believe they are criminal.
And Lemert built on this with primary and secondary deviance.
Yes, a really crucial distinction. Primary deviance is the initial rule breaking. It could have all sorts of causes: boredom, peer pressure, need, whatever, but it's often tentative, maybe sporadic, not an organized way of life. The person might rationalize it, see it as minor, maybe even acceptable in their group. Crucially, it doesn't really affect their self-concept. They don't see themselves as deviant because of it.
Okay, that's primary. What triggers secondary deviance?
The crisis point, Lemert argued, is a significant societal reaction to that primary deviance getting caught, formal sanctions, being shamed, stereotyped. Secondary deviance is the individual's response to that crisis, is the process where they resolve the crisis by accepting the deviant status and starting to organize their life and identity around that label.
So the kid who shoplifts and gets caught, labeled delinquent, might be more likely to continue than the kid who doesn't get caught.
That's the core idea. In Lemert's view, stable pattern deviance is often the end result of this interaction process. Whether primary deviance escalates depends not just on the initial acts, but crucially, on the intensity and hostility of the societal reaction.
And this idea of consequences was expanded using Merton's concept of the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. Theorists like Becker, Erickson, Kitschusys really ran with this.
Yeah.
The self-fulfilling prophecy is where a false definition of a situation leads to behavior that makes the original false assumption come true.
How does that apply to crime? Are offenders falsely defined?
Labeling theorists argue they often are. Not necessarily that they didn't commit the act, but that the system and society judge the whole person as inherently bad or incorrigible based on that act.
And the consequence of that bad label.
Is that everyone expects more bad behavior. Society, armed with these negative stereotypes, reacts accordingly, treats them with suspicion, maybe hostility.
Which leads to real-world problems.
Definitely. Discrimination in employment, for instance, even if the crime was minor or irrelevant to the job. Previous social roles, parent, worker, friend, get overshadowed. The criminal label becomes their master status.
The main thing people see and react to.
Yes, the controlling public identification, overriding everything else about them.
So to sum up this part, the false definition of offenders as inherently criminal helps fulfill that prophecy because societal reactions make it hard to conform and maybe make crime seem like the only option.
That's the core contention. The hostile reactions, the barriers finding work, housing, social exclusion make conformity incredibly difficult. Ironically, criminality can become more attractive or just more feasible. The very system meant to control crime can achieve the opposite.
But you mentioned it's not always seen as totally deterministic. People don't have to become career criminals once labeled.
Right, that's an important nuance. Downs and Rock pointed out that the criticism of the deviant as a passive victim isn't fair to all versions of the theory. Some people might react to being labeled by deciding, right, that's it, I'm proving them wrong, and stop offending. The path isn't totally fixed.
Right.
But the argument remains that for a significant number of people, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds facing more intense reactions, internalizing that label does powerfully contribute to a stable, long-term criminal identity and career.
And these labeling concepts aren't just about individuals. They apply at a group level, too, like moral panics and deviance amplification.
Absolutely. The deviancy amplification spiral from Wilkins is a great example. The basic idea is a feedback loop. Less tolerance leads to more acts defined as deviant,
Which leads to more reaction from authorities.
which leads to more alienation of the labeled group,
Which might lead to more deviance from them.
which then decreases tolerance further among conforming groups, and the cycle repeats, amplifying the original behavior or the perception of it.
And moral panic is key to this.
Central to it. Popularized by Jock Young and really developed by Stanley Cohen. Moral panics are these intense societal reactions to a perceived threat from a group or activity, often way out of proportion to the actual harm, usually fueled by media and authorities.
Cohen's study of the mods and rockers is the classic example, right?
It is. His focus wasn't on why the kids behaved as they did, but on the societal reaction, especially driven by the press. He showed how media exaggeration and distortion created public outrage.
Which led to more policing.
Yes, increased police surveillance led to more arrests, which the media then reported as proof the problem was huge, confirming their initial story. By sensationalizing the differences, the press arguably polarized the groups and maybe even encouraged more clashes. Moral entrepreneurs, politicians, police chiefs jumped on it, called for crackdowns, framed it as moral decline.
And the result was more control, more marginalization,
Right.
feeding the spiral.
Exactly. Cohen situated in the context of 1960s Britain social change, anxieties about youth, breakdown of norms.
Hall, et al. Study on mugging also used the concept.
Yes, but they linked it more explicitly to Marxist ideas about social and political structures. They argued that moral panic analysis is limited if it doesn't connect to the power structures that let a dominant minority drive the labeling. Cohen later clarified this distinction. Labeling might say society creates rules. Marxism says the state criminalizes in the interests of capital.
But the idea that panics are always top-down, elite-driven, has been challenged.
It has. Good and Ben Yehuda suggested other models. Grassroots panics from genuine public concern, even if mistaken. Elite-engineered ones serving political interests. And interest-group panics driven by specific groups like professionals or moral entrepreneurs. They also identify 5 common characteristics: disproportionate reaction, high concern, hostility to the target group, widespread consensus the threat is real, and a sense of unpredictability.
But the moral panic concept itself has faced criticism, too.
Definitely. Left realists, for example, argue that crime and fear of crime are often real problems, not just media hype. Waddington critiqued the mugging study, arguing street crime was rising and asking what a proportionate response would be if not more policing.
And applying it too broadly.
Yes, some argue its application to diverse issues like HIV/AIDS, Watney, can obscure complexities. McRobbie and Thornton suggested that in today's media-saturated world, the dynamics of panic might be different, more complex, maybe even used ironically.
Okay. So, as labeling theory gained ground, it also attracted a fair bit of criticism. What were the main ones?
Well, some critics, like Plummer, found it loosely defined, a bit of a mixed bag of positions prone to internal contradictions. Taylor, Walton, and Young felt it was vague, inconsistent, and didn't clearly separate description from explanation.
Gibbs raised a definitional problem about secret deviance.
Right. If deviance is defined by reaction, how can you talk about secret deviants who aren't reacted to? Or primary deviance before a reaction? Gibbs argued this implies deviance exists before reaction based on norms, which contradicts the core definition. He also distinguished soft deviance, relative definitions, from hard deviance, violence, robbery, arguing labeling is less relevant for the latter, where offenders often know it's wrong regardless of reaction.
Another big one was the passive victim criticism.
Yes, that labeling theory overemphasized societal reaction and neglected individual agency and motives. Goldner famously critiqued it for making the offender seem more sinned against than sinning, ignoring their active role.
Though you said that might be an oversimplification of the theory.
Downs and Rock argued it applies mainly to rigid versions, where the label automatically leads to secondary deviance. Becker defended the focus on the deviant as balancing traditional criminology's bias.
But perhaps the most significant criticism
Was its failure to systematically analyze social structure and power. Early theorists acknowledged power mattered, but they didn't really connect the dots between the criminal justice system, capitalism, and systemic inequality in a deep way. That was a gap.
a gap that later developments tried to fill.
Exactly. There was a shift around the mid-70s moving away from studying, as Liazos critically put it, just nuts, sluts, and perverts, towards a more direct focus on the state, law, and the process of criminalization itself.
This led to criminalization theories.
Yes, like Harchin's work, linking labeling to the sociology of law, seeing law as a tool of social control. And relatedly, controlology emerged, looking at CJ agencies as part of a much wider network of state control, welfare, health, education, media managing problem populations.
Influenced by Foucault.
Heavily. Ideas about the disciplinary control matrix, the velvet glove over the iron fist.
And labeling concepts were also applied to understanding mental illness.
Yes, powerfully. Link's research showed how fear of stigma and labeling can lead people with mental health issues to hide their condition, withdraw, avoid help, making things worse. The anticipated reaction has real effects.
And there's been concern about increasing stigmatization in the justice system, especially for young people.
Yes. DeHaan noted how rising fear of violence can lead to relabeling minor acts as serious, leading to harsher treatment. Triplett saw this in the U.S. in the 80s, 90s, treating young violent offenders as evil, and that label spreading to all young offenders, increasing isolation. Miosi linked this demonizing to economic downturns, suggesting scapegoating. Halpern argued harsher treatment itself devalues people via labeling, potentially accelerating offending. A vicious cycle.
But labeling theory isn't all negative. There's reintegrative shaming.
Right. A really important positive application from John Braithwaite. He argues shame can be constructive, but only if it's done right. He contrasts stigmatizing shaming, labeling the person as bad, leading to exclusion, with reintegrative shaming.
Which shames the act, but not the person.
Exactly. It communicates disapproval of the act, but maintains respect for the person, emphasizes forgiveness, and aims to reintegrate them into the community.
And this underpins restorative justice.
It's a fundamental pillar. Programs in New Zealand, Australia, the US, UK, especially for youth, try to bring victims, offenders, community together to repair harm and reintegrate. Braithwaite argued it can work even in cities by fostering micro-solidarities.
And he suggested it's good for white-collar crime, too.
Yes, contrasting it with the tendency to ignore or downplay crimes by the powerful. It offers a way to hold them accountable, repair harm, and reintegrate, rather than just letting it slide.
Okay, that's an incredibly thorough run-through of labeling theory, its roots, concepts, consequences, criticisms, and later developments. It really paints that picture of the criminal potentially being a victim of the social reaction. Now, let's shift gears to that second major foundation for the victimized actor model, conflict theories. You said this starts from a completely different place than consensus theories.
Completely different. The conventional view may be associated most with Talcott Parsons. Sees society is based on fundamental consensus, broad agreement on goals, norms, laws. Conflict theory rejects that entirely. It draws on a long tradition that sees society not as harmonious, but as inherently conflict-ridden.
And our source introduces some classical thinkers here, starting with Max Weber.
Yes, Weber. Hugely influential. He saw conflict coming from multiple sources, not just one. His model is called pluralistic conflict from different areas and maybe a bit pessimistic. He saw conflict mainly stemming from struggles over scarce resources, especially in the economy. But he didn't stop there. He analyzed different types of stratification: class, economic position, party, political power, and status, social prestige, lifestyle. Conflict happens across all these dimensions.
Including conflict over ideas and values.
Yes, and he really emphasized the role of authorities in the ongoing struggle by different status groups to use legislative power to boost their own life chances, their opportunities. His pessimism came from believing that while capitalism might change, conflict is inherent, permanent, just becoming routinized into ongoing power struggles.
Then there's Georg Simmel, described as a sometimes neglected founder.
Yes, but really influential for both interactionism and conflict theory. Simmel had a starker view, maybe summed up by Homo lupus's man is a wolf to man, suggesting underlying antagonism. He thought we only see fragments of our true selves through group involvement. He saw the self as inherently social, multi-layered depending on context. Groups provide interaction patterns but never fully capture our individuality. His focus was on the constant, everyday conflicts within and between groups, envies, wants, desires.
And he emphasized form over content.
Right. He studied the recurring forms of interaction, like conflict, cooperation, hierarchy, rather than just the specific topic. This let him identify social types that reappear: the stranger, the enemy, the criminal, the pauper. He noted how strangers or immigrants often become scapegoats. He saw association, the process of interaction, making society as like art or a game. Groups are always in internal conflict because they can't satisfy the whole individual, and in external conflict due to overlapping memberships crossing boundaries. It's this ongoing dynamic expression of selves.
And he even suggested society itself is a kind of lie.
In a philosophical sense, yes. He meant we constantly engage in self-deception and deceiving others as we present ourselves and navigate expectations. Social structures are partly defined by how much lying or strategic self-presentation is allowed. Within this, the criminal is a social type. Maybe someone who lost integrity by conforming too much, or someone who sought too much individuality or anonymity, stepping outside acceptable forms of interaction.
And then, of course, Karl Marx, the most radical conflicts perspective.
Definitely the most radical and perhaps widely known. For Marxists, conflict isn't just one feature of society. It's the fundamental engine of history, driven by the struggle to abolish the social divisions created by material arrangements, specifically economic class relations.
Marxism has a distinct view of human nature, homo faber.
Yes, homo faber, human as maker-creator, influenced by Engels, picked up by Quinney. It sees humans as fundamentally unfinished, dynamic, striving to realize creative potential. It rejects explanations based just on socialization or norms, arguing humans are never fully socialized, have higher loyalties, or active culture builders.
So it rejects both the pure rational actor and the purely predestined actor.
Right. It rejects free will, isolated from context, and rejects rigid determinism. There's an influence from romantic thought, seeing a spirit that can rebel against oppression.
And their way of knowing, skeptical realism.
Yes, a realism, but deeply skeptical, disenchanted, echoing legal realists who saw law as power. Nothing is morally neutral. Marxist analysis insists on the need to critique, expose, demystify the social order. Critique for its own sake is important to reveal underlying power.
And the methodology is dialectical historical materialism.
Right. Taking Hegel's dialectic but grounding it in material conditions, not abstract ideas. History is seen as the product of material conditions and class struggle. Analysis often looks back, tracing the conflict between producers, workers, and appropriators, owners, over centuries.
This leads to economic reductionism, seeing class conflict as the root of everything.
Essentially, yes. The total fundamental source of conflict is seen as economic class relations. Capitalism is inherently contradictory. Forces production expand, but relations of production, ownership, are fixed to maintain power, leading inevitably to conflict.
And the state, the criminal justice system, are reflections of this.
They're seen as reflections and tools of economic realities. The CJ system primarily protects the interests of the economically powerful capitalist class. Economic powerlessness translates directly to political powerlessness, making the working class vulnerable to control by laws made by and for the owners.
And this leads to the idea of some criminals as proto-revolutionary.
Yes, particularly those committing property crimes or resisting state authority. Their actions are interpreted not just as individual deviance, but as a response, often desperate, to exploitation under capitalism. By breaking capitalist laws, they're seen, in some views, as implicitly recognizing their true interests and engaging in primitive rebellion.
paving the way for a socialist society. That's the hope embedded in that perspective. A society free from want, where conflict from material deprivation is eliminated. Marxist scholars often aim to politicize criminals, seeing them not just as offenders but as potential agents of change.
And this primitive rebellion idea comes from Marx himself.
It's rooted in his writings, yes. In Das Kapital, he described how the poor displaced by feudalism's breakdown couldn't adapt to capitalism's harsh discipline. Many became beggars, robbers, vagabonds out of circumstance. Marx noted the law treated them as criminals acting out of free will when it was really their inability to survive under the new conditions created by capitalism. Their crime was a response to an unjust system.
Exactly. Now, our source mentions later, conflict theorists didn't always explicitly reference these classics, but their ideas resonated. Ralph Dahrendorf is key here.
Yes, Dahrendorf offered a conflict perspective that differed significantly from Marx. He agreed conflict was inherent, but saw its main source not necessarily in economics, but in the struggle over authority.
Control of authority.
Right. Writing in the late 50s amid social disorder, he accepted conflict was inevitable, but believed societies could develop new ways to accommodate it. He actually saw conflict as a motor for change, pushing societies to integrate better. He was critical of consensus thinkers and of what he saw as utopian Marxists promising crime would vanish under socialism.
His view was more pluralist, many groups conflicting over authority.
Exactly. The challenge was to develop institutions to accommodate these competing interests, and he fundamentally disagreed with Marx on inequality's source. For Dahrendorf, it's rooted in power and authority relationships themselves, not just economics. He argued inequality is inescapable because norms need sanctions, which requires power differences. Someone has to have authority. So dominance-subjection relationships are inherent even in families, let alone the CJ system.
And the American context was important for how these ideas were received.
Very much so. The Cold War era aversion to Marxism meant there was a need for non-socialist ways to explain the obvious conflicts emerging civil rights, rising crime rates. This made the context more receptive to conflict explanations based on power, authority, and group interests, like the early work of Vold, Turk, and Quinney, which the source discusses earlier in the chapter.
Which brings us to the broader context of radical criminology in the 60s and 70s.
Right. It grew out of that era's chaos and critique of Western societies, prioritizing wealth over human need, the fracturing post-war consensus, concerns about quality of life. The student movement was a big driver.
There was also critique of the welfare state.
Yes. While welfare states improved things, radical critics argued they fell short and became new forms of control. Benefits came with conditions, not as rights. They saw the welfare state as part of an oppressive apparatus managing problem populations.
And this period saw a search for broad theories to explain society.
Definitely. Minority groups demanding rights, Black civil rights, Northern Ireland, the women's movement developed their own historical, political, economic analyses to push for change. This search for theories explaining inequality and power continues in later movements too.
Okay, so we've explored labeling and conflict theories in detail. How do they both come together to support this victimized actor model?
Well, they support it in complementary ways, really. Labeling theory focuses our attention on the social process, how being defined and reacted to as criminal can shape identity, opportunities, behavior. By highlighting those unintended negative consequences, stigma, exclusion, self-fulfilling prophecy, it argues the individual becomes a victim of that social process. It's not just the act, but the reaction that can trap them.
Right. The system's reaction can become part of the problem.
Exactly. And conflict theory provides the crucial macro-level backdrop for this. It argues the whole framework, what gets defined as crime, who enforces laws, how they're enforced, isn't neutral. It's shaped by power and inequality. Whether you take a Marxist view, economic class, or Dahrendorf's view, authority, the core idea is the system disproportionately targets the less powerful.
So the labeled criminal is often a victim of an unjust system.
That's the argument. A system where rules and their application protect the powerful and control the powerless, especially when their behavior challenges the existing order.
So both theories push us beyond just looking at the individual.
Absolutely. They challenge the idea that crime is just about individual failing or choice. They force us to look at the powerful causal factors in the social and political environment, in inequality, and in how society defines and reacts. They paint a picture where the criminal is heavily influenced, maybe even partly determined, by forces acting on them, making them, in this framework, a victim of society itself.
Wow.
That was an incredibly detailed and, yeah, thought-provoking deep dive. It really does turn conventional thinking on its head. So, just to recap.
We explored the victimized actor model, seeing the criminal, at least partly, as a victim of societal forces and reactions.
We saw how labeling theories from symbolic interactionism shift focus from the act to the reaction. We unpacked its concerns, how acts get defined as criminal by moral entrepreneurs,
Why certain people get labeled due to biases and extra legal factors.
and the often negative consequences. Dramatization of evil, primary versus secondary deviance, self-fulfilling prophecies, master status.
And we looked at group-level applications like deviancy, amplification, and moral panics, covering studies, criticisms, and later ideas like control phenomenology and the positive side, reintegrative shaming.
Then we explored conflict theories, rejecting consensus for conflict. We looked at Weber, Simmel, Marx locating conflict in economics, status, interaction, class struggle, seeing the state reflecting power dynamics.
And later figures like Dahrendorf focusing on authority, all within the context of radical criminology's critique of society and the state.
Taken together, these perspectives demand we look beyond the individual offender and critically examine how society itself, its power structures, inequalities, reactions, defines, and maybe even produces crime and deviance.
It really challenges us to look past simplistic headlines about bad guys and consider systemic forces. Why are certain groups overrepresented? How might the system itself make things worse?
And for you, the listener, as you think about all this, here's maybe a final provocative thought. If defining and reacting to crime is so tangled up with power, inequality, and potentially harmful consequences,
What does that suggest about the possibility of creating a criminal justice system that's truly fair, truly just, or even effective in reducing harm for everyone in society?
or perhaps think about how these ideas labeling stereotypes, interventions backfiring might play out elsewhere. In schools, workplaces, how we talk about social problems like poverty or addiction, even outside the formal justice system.
Definitely things worth mulling over.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the victimized actor model and its foundations in labeling and conflict theories.
Our pleasure.